Welcome to the Profitability and Conservation session. My name is Greg Steele. I'm a dairy lending specialist with Compure Financial out of Baldwin, Wisconsin, and we're very happy to be the sponsor of this morning's session. Couple things I've learned. I've had the opportunity to be a board member on Farmers for Sustainable Food, and there's kind of a simple way that I look at conservation and sustainability and economics, and it boils down to a couple things. Good for people, good for the planet, and good for profit. So I think that's a way that the lens I look at sustainability for economics and for profitable dairies. We have an outstanding panel this morning. Our speakers will be Keith Olander, Executive Director, Ag-Centric Minnesota State Northern Center of Agricultural Excellence up in central Minnesota someplace. Corey Stallsberg, Farm Business and Production Management Instructor, Southwest Wisconsin Technical College. Welcome. Then we have Tom Gregory, owner Mill Creek Dairy Farms, Stearns County, Minnesota, which happens to be the largest dairy county in Minnesota, right, Tom? And then pitch hitting for Jim Nguyen, he had a change in schedule, is where is it? Cody Carpenter. I apologize for the pause there. And Cody Carpenter is of Red Rock View Farms near Darlington. He farms 600 cows and 2,000 acres with his family, and is a founding member of the Lafayette Ag Stewardship Alliance. Looking forward to today's discussion, and with that, we'll kick it off.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. My dairy story began in the year 1976. My brother and parents determined that we needed to milk cows. My dad was actually a tool maker by trade, but they purchased 12 cows. Understand, I'm 5 years old at that point. We milked at the time. We had cans. And our big then moved up to a step saver eventually, and then over time into a pipeline was my experience. My dad eventually liquidated the herds after all the kids left. I have 10 siblings. So we grew up on a diversified farm, so there was something to do for all of us. We had dairy and beef and hogs and chickens, and so away we went. But today's agriculture, as we can tell, is certainly changing. As we learned downstairs in the talk this morning was this idea of we become irrelevant if we don't change. So my goal here this morning is to share a few things. I am a college administrator for Minnesota State. I work with farm business management pretty intensely. Very big fan of that program. And share some of the data that we're learning about some of the pieces that you take, particularly as dairy farmers, in conservation practices and what those economics look like. I was asked at breakfast, what is the barrier to adoption, right? Why don't farmers adopt technology faster? The bottom line is, you got to pay the bills. So as fast as we can do that, we want to do that and adopt very quickly, because at heart, all of us, and I farm 500 acres today and crop farm, but it's this idea of how do I make it better for the next generation? I think we share that as farmers. But the other side of this is, what does it look like in the public eye? This conservation and sustainability, probably more so than I think of when I was part of that original dairy back in 1976 as a kid. You were trying to figure out how to make it and milk cows. You didn't even think about the customer at that point necessarily, but that's certainly a different world. But they had this curiosity, and I spent 14 years in the high school classroom, and today work in the college system, but they have a new fascination for our youth coming out about where does my food originate? What's it doing to our environment? And so all of these partnerships and economic data really are not available widely because we just don't have the length of time when we talk about conservation practices. I'm going to share one in particular and then get into a few on the cover crop side. I hope that you can identify as a producer somewhere in the financial chain with this idea that farming economics, I'm going to show that go up and down over the years. And when there's profitability, farmers are going to adapt. First and foremost, they're going to pay the bills. And so that financial viability is critical, but on the other side, they want to do everything they can for the improvement health of that herd as well as the land. And so how do they balance that and make that happen? Farm business management, Corey and I are going to talk a little bit about, but if you're not familiar with that, operates around 18 states in the country. It is one-on-one. In our case, it is a college program. The farmers do not go to the college. The faculty go to the farm. It all based around what is going on with that farm business. They take place at their particular business, office, wherever that is. We use this tool called FinPack. I assume all of you have heard of FinBin. If you haven't, you probably should Google that and learn a little bit about that. It's one of the largest tools in the country and the world in terms of economic data, but it's FinBin, you can Google that. I'm going to come from a Minnesota perspective. Corey will talk from a Wisconsin perspective. Last year we had 2,300 farms do a complete farm analysis. You may say, how many of them are dairy? Roughly about 400. In our state, we have about 30% of the dairy herds over 200 head in our database. We carry dairy sector very heavy. You can see the density about that, but we carry a large geographic of the state in what's going on. A lot of numbers here. I'm just using an example of what we teach and how we go about this. I think you all understand benchmarking. This is an idea of soybeans. It gives you an idea of what my farm is there on this side over here, what these numbers are. So let's just pick on seed, fertilizer, chemical, what the group median is. I call it a shotgun blast to the page. You know more than ever, and I found this out last year. In our database, our average farm size now is over $1 million gross. To some of you, I know that's peanuts. To some of you, that's pretty good money. The bottom line is the dollars going through the farm family hands rise every year. So it is more and more critical that you have a team of people that you manage what you've got going on there, which means you need to measure it, and that's what we do in this particular case. How do we use this? Let's just step forward. I'm going to pick on fuel. This particular farm, the median was $12.64. This particular farm was $19.43. A faculty may ask the question, why? You may pick this out of your veterinary, your DHI, whatever the records are indicating to you. But the idea is we don't move across the page like go from top to bottom, and you should be on all sides of the page, but how do we move everything better in 5% increments? So that gives you an example of what our program is and where we go. I love this chart and begin to look at this. This gives a historical context, 1996 to 2021. Our 22 data is just coming into play right now. We'll publish that in April. As you can tell, if you're not familiar with farm income, it is up and down. This is median, middle of the road. So for us, 1,000 farms below, 1,000 farms above. Very interesting. I was with Vilsack last week at a national conference. He was speaking, and of course, NAS came out with their predictions as they closed out their October 1, their fiscal year, and what their predictions were. He said the exact same thing. Median net farm income for 22 is going to hit a record, and we expect the same, probably higher than 12. Half the farms below, half the farms above, which means there's a significant amount of farms that actually lose money even in good years. All right, the key here is how do we manage through this? And I'm going to throw in a line here that's very arbitrary, no data behind it. But for those of us involved in agriculture, whether you are a farmer or you're supporting farmers, that line gives you an instance of where we adopt technology and we adopt conservation practices. So when we go back to say 7, 10, 12, we can openly adopt. We've got cash in the business to do so. Look at new practice and adoption. And for those of us that lived through 13 through 19, we figured out how to pay bills. Keep the operating down. Let's not remortgage this thing 3 times over, right? And sustain ourselves financially. And that's the key in agriculture. Now the long term is how do we drop the bottoms out, and can conservation economics help us do that? But I think it's all that we need to understand not every year is the win, and so we've got to manage through the losses. Okay, the first cohort I'll talk about in Minnesota, our Department of Ag does a water quality certification. They take care of the certification of farms. The farmer gets a free pass for any new regulation that comes out over the next 10 years, and now they've built on enhancements where they can get into additional programming. So the Department of Ag came to us and said, hey, we want to know what the data looks like for people in this cohort. So in this case, we have 94 farms, 42 counties that compare to our overall chart that are water quality certified. Again, it's an environmental practice because some farmers would say, this practice may cost me money or I can't afford that. So I'm going to go through a lot of numbers. We can hand the PowerPoint out later, but I just want to go for this piece here. And the idea, we were able to get to a point where we did 19, 20, and 21, and you'll see the numbers. We grew from 53 to 94. The interesting thing on here, beginning farmer, went from 7 to 24. So there was a tripling in terms of the involvement of beginning farmers in this particular water quality sort. You can get in the other side. The other thing we found very interesting is that because our dairies are such a large component of our database, those that are water quality certified tend to have livestock as opposed to our average database. So what this is telling you, the big database, 50% crops. The water quality certified, 50% livestock. And we think there's a little play on numbers in there that we're going to continue to look into, and here's why. So what we did is we took the start, and we did this 3 years long. And we looked at the different things. What happened to these certified farms prior to being certified in 2016 to 2018, and then what happened post or during 19 to 20 to 21? Because the bottom line is they're coming up more profitable. And so pretty soon people are saying, well, does water quality certification make you more money? And that was really the question. And really what I want you to just key in on here in a couple aspects is this idea that, no, actually, these farms were more profitable prior to certification. The difference is, and this is where I'm going to inject in a little of my thinking in terms of what's going on here, these managers are early adopters. Water quality certification came out. They said, hey, it's good for me. I'm going to go through the practices and take the risk of it causing me to cost more money. But it's good for what I'm doing for the farm. And so what we found is that the profitability remained front to back at 113% to 150. And you pretty much see that consistent all the way down, even if you go down into the median net farms in terms of what's going on there, consistencies. So that's that one, and that shows that. Now what can we derive from that particular story? And I better back up because I want you to look at cover crops here. Farmers that tell me water quality certification hurts my profitability, I can say absolutely not. And that's one of my slides I deleted out of here, but that is one of the things that we look at in terms of economics and profitability and conservation. Does the practice be able to do that? Now what I'm really excited about is we launched a 100-farm study now this year for the first time on specific cover crops, looking at multiple enterprises. Because you know the hubbub around the cover crops. And I'm not saying there's not good about it, I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of companies throwing out money. These are good, right? And it's all about how do we adopt them, what do we do, what does it do geographically, what does it do for whether I'm a crop farmer, row crop, or whether I'm livestock. So we started, and this was our last look this past year, and as you know, we came into some of the legislative pieces. We had cover crop only, grown after cover crop. I'm looking at soybeans, and then putting them together. What we find, first of all, is this particular number right here, and this is where I'm getting to some of the legislative pieces. I testify later this afternoon on the Minnesota side. You know, they want to throw the $25 an acre out there, and that's great. That's an incentive certainly to do that, and I'm not suggesting that we supplement fully or fund fully. But really, if we want to look at cover crops as an enterprise, we need to start to look at, is it truly an enterprise in the farm? Is it just what we're looking at in seed and fertilizer and maybe a pass? Or is there really some overhead expenses that we need to be putting into there? Because if that's real, I really need to start looking at maybe this is almost $100 per acre per enterprise. These are some of the things we got to start looking at, and particularly as I work with our senators on the federal farm bill going forward, what we think we're going to start seeing in that. This is why we want to get into that. And what really excites me, I know this is only 11 fields, but I'm going to be happy to tell you, just like I did with water quality in 3 years, this is what the economics around cover crops look like. Why? Because farmers as we go forward are going to start to look at, does this help my farm or hurt my farm? Now on our side, we're not doing anything with what it's doing for soil health. So let's just dive into that for a second. First of all, this just takes a look at what we saw in yield. Roughly no difference in yield per acre. Net return, there's some differences there. Do I get too shook about that right now? No, because I got 1 year. Give me 3 years, and then we'll come back. Let's talk about soil health. So Headwaters Ag Sustainability Partnership, with Tom is here to share as well, we work with this particular organization. So within our database and farms, in Stearns County particularly, is our largest dairy county in Minnesota, there's this particular group as a partnership that comes together, all of these particular businesses, and our role through Minnesota State is just to do the economics on these particular farms. Then we got folks like Houston Engineering that come in and really start to key in on what the soil health looks like. So this idea that we look at the relationship between the on-farm conservation finances, we started in 19 with only 3 farms, and Tom is one of those founder farms. And we're expanding now, so we're going to have this up to 20 farms going forward, 100 farms on the cover crop specific on that. But this stuff is real. This is what we're seeing. And of course, I'm not trying to sell you on something. I'm just saying the early pieces are showing us that our return on investment report is showing very clearly, and Sauk River is just attached to Stearns County to the south side, that more than likely in every category, they're showing strength in production, in yield, and in profitability. So this is where we're really get excited about it. Okay, you can find this on the HASP page. Really what I want to share are the 2 components that are going on here. Is this financial versus sustainable? And this breaks down our data even further. So up top is what we would collect, and I'm looking at Alfalfa here, 2019. Where does the particular farm fall? And in this case, this farm signed off. This is Kerfeld View Farm, and they're just looking at where they fell in terms of where the actual benchmark is. And they scored fairly well above all of it. But now what I like here is we start looking at these aspects of soil conservation, soil carbon, and greenhouse gases. And how do those compare? And how does that look? Because we know from the consumer side, if I go to the store and buy the product, and the consumer is not related to the farm, what's the price and what impact was it on the environment? And I come back to this whole balancing act that comes into play. And I put that down here in the bottom of my earlier slide in terms of how the farmer needs to balance those. So again, it just highlights how do we take farm viability and compare it to what we're doing on an environmental impact. And it's a different way to view farmer data, but also for a farmer to be able to own what they're going on. And from my side, I'm looking at how do we prove or disprove whether we're going to maintain profitability on this. And of course, the other thing, I'm not going to get into a lot of argument. I've been on, again, national stage last week. We were looking at this. There's no consistency that I'm aware of in carbon scoring, carbon sequestration. There's a lot of markets in terms of offerings and what's going. But to say everybody's in agreement as to what constitutes a ton of carbon stored and what the farmer's already doing, that doesn't exist. That will shake out. I think as we learned to the talk downstairs, some of this stuff is just coming on board, and you give us probably the 28 Farm Bill will be able to define it. So I know you love hearing just from those that are not necessarily on a farm, but Tom is here, Mill Creek Dairy, one of these early adopters, and he's going to share just a little bit from the standpoint of what have I done on my farm and how is it influencing my economics. So, Tom?
Well, good morning, everyone. So I'm Tom Gregory, and I'm here to share conservation practices with you that we have been doing over the years, and I'm sure many of you have practices that you're doing as well. Mill Creek Dairy was named after a creek that flows around our buildings and through our farm. It has offered us many challenges over the years with all the building projects and so forth that have been going on. In the beginning, it was an asset for us. The dairy cattle crossed the creek and drank water from it. The heifers crossed the creek and drank water from it. And we had hogs, and they wallowed in it as well. They crossed the creek to get to pastures. We had pastures, and we had fields where we stripped the fields and would move a wire every day. But after a while, that got old because of bugs and so forth, and so we just let it go. The other thing is the ducks loved it when the cattle were in the creek, because then they would swim around them and eat the corn out of their feces. So and the hogs was the same thing. The hogs would go out there, we'd let them out of the farrowing crates, and they'd go out there and wallow in the mud, and they'd come back and put them back in the farrowing crates, and little pigs, that was lunchtime for them too. About the mid-60s, dairy animals were fenced out of the creek because we started noticing lesions on the teats, and there was other problems with the udder and so forth, and the heifers continued across the creek, and the hogs had a tendency to get there as well. And about that same time, extensions start getting involved, and they start, and other organizations, they start talking about pollution and so forth, so we start getting concerned about runoff from the feedlots and the animals in the creek. They muddied up the sides of the creek, and so by taking them out, the creek kind of knitted itself back to its natural flow, natural borders. The cattle at that time, there wasn't that many, so there was probably 25, 30 dairy cows, and they were housed on bed pack. And the bed pack was hauled out in the spring of the year, plowed down, and it was like a drag mounted on the plow to level over the bumps and so forth. And the corn was planted by what they call wheel track planting, and probably most of you don't know what it is anymore. That was a thing that was quit back in the mid-60s, but that was conservation. That was one pass. They plowed it down. They came through with like a small tractor with the wheels set 40 inches apart, and they drove on the rows. It firmed the soil, so good seed contact, but it was two-row and it was slow, and as the farms increased in size, that was dropped on the wayside. The other problem is the soil was so loose that if you did have a drying wind, it dried the soils out very quickly. And at that same time, Extension was involved in addressing, we had lighter fields. A lot of people had the lighter fields, and they had 50, 60 acre fields, and there was a severe problem with the wind erosion. And so the extension was there before Soil Water Service and DNR and FSA, and so they were the ones that we went to the answers for at the time. But they developed, set it up so that we do like 10 acre strips, and you alternate the crops, corn, oats, alfalfa, so that you won't get a big wind coming up and rip everything off. That worked well. They also was the beginning of contour farming. And we had a 30 acre field that had a lot of washing to it all the time, and they contoured it. They made it into a lot of little fields, and we alternated them as well. They were very proud of that, the way it worked. That field turned into be one of our most successful fields, and they brought legislative people out on bus trips and to show it off. And I think they're trying to get conservation into the minds of the people so that they help funnel money for some of these projects. As our cattle grew in numbers, us kids were getting bigger and helping the folks out. We got to 40 dairy cows, and we threw out the bed pack and brought in free stalls. We had a 3-stall surge parlor, and you could milk the cows in a couple hours, but I think we went backwards, and we didn't know it at the time, because now we were scraping and hauling every day. If we could haul, if we couldn't haul, we piled it up somewhere, and probably in a swamp or somewhere where it was land that we couldn't use, and when the fields opened up, we'd haul it out. And this went on for about 20 years. About that time, I was finishing high school, and I went on to, I had like 3 different careers I followed, and the one that lasted the longest was a refrigeration career. I worked on the waterfront in Jacksonville, Florida, and I met my wife there, and we bought a house and started raising kids. And one night my dad called, and he said, none of the other siblings want to run the farm. If you want a dairy, now's your chance. And we had talked about it before I got married, so it wasn't, she was ready for it. So we sold our house, and in the spring of 1980, we moved to the dairy. We bought a trailer house. That's where we lived in the first couple of years. And I, the thing was set up with a accountant that I had to maintain 43 cows to make the payments to my parents. And that only lasted a couple of years. I was up to 50, 55, 60, and this whole manure problem started getting worse. About the mid-90s, I hired a crop consultant because I had been listening to all the old timers tell me how to farm, and some things were right and some things were wrong, and that was the best money I ever spent, because we start targeting weeds, we start spreading manure properly, getting our resources back, and corn hybrids too. I was going with early day, so it dried down faster in the corn dryer, and I could get done earlier, and he changed all that, and we became much more profitable after that. We also had a lot of extension put on, and we had adult farm management we were working with at the same time, and they put on a lot of mini courses and courses at night, and I attended a lot of them. I didn't realize the importance of soil samples. Our pH was low. We had trouble raising alfalfa, and through extension, I got the pH up to 6, 8, 7, whatever, and our crops start getting a lot better, and our herbicides and insecticides, everything start working a lot better. In the early 90s, we bought our first chisel plow. That was a huge improvement as well. We didn't realize the washing that was going on from the moldboard plowing, and that just helped us a lot. And then about like in 94, about when we got into irrigation, we found a well that could run irrigation, and my brother and I bought an irrigator. We could, a center pivot that was towable, we could do 240s with it, and now we had control over the droughty years, and there again, it helped make us more profitable. And at that time, the dairy was getting exhausted, so I had to make a decision: do we build or do we quit? Our little surge parlor was being welded on every day almost, and we were over the limit on the cows, and so we decided we're going to build. I wanted to build a 150 cow dairy on the spot where my old dairy was, and through adult farm management, and it showed it one cash flow. I thought it would have. I thought we had enough land base. I thought it'd work well. So we went back to the drawing table, and I started working with another business management outfit that worked with the larger dairies, and he suggested that we go out in the field and start over. He said, you're going to spend all this money over here. You got a wife and young kids. Something happens to you, you're up against this creek. The creek is there for everything that you want to do. The creek is in the way. And so he came out and he drew a line through a piece of paper sitting in his car. He said, why would you build here? Why won't you go and start over? the line got longer on this side, so that was a plan. Then my brother came into organization and, excuse me, and another farmer that lived close by, he wanted in. He was dealing with the same problems as me, so we put together a 300-cow dairy. It's a double 12 parallel parlor, and it cash flowed. And because we went across the road and started over, then the SWCD was going, and through that and FSA, through grants, they put in a 2.5 million gallon pit. So now we really had something, and the crop consultant had something to work with, and he could take all our nutrients and through drag holes and knifing in the manure, we got down to where the only time we used commercial fertilizer was on alfalfa ground. And that continued, we continued to grow. Unfortunately, after a couple of years, the neighbor wanted to get bought out, so we bought him out, and that kind of set us back for a while. But then we started going again, and in 2011, I believe it was, well, the bedding was very expensive and it was hard to get. I think we were dealing with some kind of recession, and there just wasn't a lot of wood shavings available. And I had exploring the idea of a manure separator, and so we went ahead with that. We had to build a special building, heated building for that, and we put that in, and we slowly switched our cattle over to all deep bedding. We had built a barn just for fresh cows because we had trouble with fresh cows coming in, and they were nervous about free stalls, and we were getting a lot of DAs, and we used one barn just bed packs just for that, and that solved that problem. But when we got to deep, and we also added on to our main barn, we put in an area for what we call nursing home cows that were a little hard to get around, and another side for breeding heifers. Well, the breeding heifer thing didn't work very well. And so when we got started with the deep bedding, we threw all the bed packs out and put in deep free stalls. And to this day, we hardly ever have an animal resist laying in a free stall. And so that all went over quite well. And at the same time, we got involved with another dairy. They wanted to quit, and their boys were talking to my boys, and somehow we ended up buying their cattle, and he was a classmate of mine. I thought, what's wrong with this picture? You know, he was retiring, and I was buying his cattle. And anyway, so we use that barn for pregnant heifers and dry cows, and we use the bedding from our separator to bed that barn as well. And at the same time, we found another person to raise some of our young stock, and also we found another farm to take our cattle at breeding age, and after confirmed pregnant the second time, then they're brought back to that farm that we leased where we keep the pregnant animals. So my son Nicholas, he's a graduate out of Crookston University, and he had an ag degree, and he was poking me about we should plant something after corn silage, and I said, no, we want to be done. And I was reading, I read a lot, we get a lot of magazines, and I was reading more and more about the cover crops, so I talked to my crop consultant, and I said, well, what can we put in? He goes, he was the same age as me, he said, don't talk to me about cover crops. But anyway, he helped me, and we found a farm by Little Falls that had put in barley, and the neighboring farm to the lease farm was into other types of crops. He had peas, and he harvested the peas, and he said, I have 200 acres here open, and I'd like to explore cover crops, so would you buy them for your livestock? And I said, yes, we would. And so we put in 200 acres of barley, and we did it August 15th. That was supposed to be the perfect day, and it grew real well. Then all of a sudden it got cold and rainy, and they irrigated a lot, and it got like that high, and we thought, well, we'll wait, and it's October, we'll wait a little more, get the end of October, and oh crap, and then it started raining, and finally we got a window to harvest it, and we cut it, and they hadn't prepared the ground. You just went in and seeded it, and the winter order was plugging up, and my son calls. He said, I need a shovel. He had cleaned the head off, and it was a disaster harvesting it. And then our mergers, the same thing, would plug up. So we ended up taking an old side deliver rake over there and raking in windrows. And finally, we got a little bit of a window where it got dry enough. We could drag the chopper and wagons through the mud, and we harvested it. And we just got up against a snowstorm. But we bagged it over at that other farm, and the feed never fermented, but it was excellent. But I kept working on it, and we tried triticale, and we tried peas, and they froze out. And the next year, I think we did oats, that worked okay. And finally, we got hooked up with rye. And rye has been a lifesaver for us. It works really, really well. It has a real knitted root system. And so we learned so when we put the rye in it after chopping, well, first we put on liquid manure, we put on liquid manure, probably about 10,000 gallons, whatever a crop consultant suggested. And then we put in the crop, and it starts growing, so it's there for the winter. If we have open winter, it keeps the soil from blowing. In the spring, as soon as the snow melts, it takes off again. And so by late May, we harvested for the young stock. We thought it was just for the young stock, but we got more and more farmers involved. They saw us doing it, so now we're up to 300 acres, and we got like 1,500 ton of this stuff on the silage pad. And so our nutritionists start subbing it in for haylage and corn silage, and it worked very well. We run like a 26,000 pound herd average, 1,100 fat, and 3-4 protein, and it never dropped. And so we utilize it through all the diets for all the animals on the farm, and it works very well. And I'm thinking that maybe we need to make room for it to feed it all year round. Anyway, one thing I got to say about the cover crops is they work well. I visited with a man, like I call him a cover crop guru on Friday, and he said, well, you need to have a purpose. When you're planting a cover crop, have a purpose. Well, we have a purpose. We're utilizing it for feed, but you just can't throw it out there. You have to prepare the ground somewhat too, so that you don't have the problem like I stated earlier, where my son was trying to cut it and he was plugging the head up. But so now we're hooked up with a deal where a guy has a 30-foot disc, and he's got an air seeder on it, and he's got gangs all along, and he blows the seed into the ground. The disc, we set it about 1.5 inches. You just level it a little bit to get rid of the lumps, and then the harrow falls behind it, and you run behind that with a brilliant seeder, and it just does a beautiful job. And so the message I gotta leave is know what you're doing with the cover crops, explore it, talk to other people, and I'm sure it'll work out for you. I think it can work for anybody. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. Corey Salford with Southwest Tech, Farm Business Production Management. Keith did a phenomenal job at introducing us to some of the data that is being collected, and you have access to that through the FinBin database. The Wisconsin folks here at the Circle Technical College, we contribute data to that database as well, and just kind of wanted to highlight those across the state. So anybody in here that is not from Wisconsin?
Corey, turn your microphone
Oh,
on.
sorry. I just like to yell. I'm sorry.
So do I.
Thanks, Pam. Okay, so those are just some of the technical colleges across the state that offer the Farm Business Production Management program, and Keith touched on that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. So we were involved with a project here the last 3 years at Southwest Tech, the Farmers for Sustainable Food and the LASA group that Cody's going to be talking about here shortly. So we were called in to complete a farm financial analysis and breaking down all the different enterprises on the farm. So we were targeted to the dairy industry, and we mostly worked with 4 dairy farms and completed a full farm financial analysis where we broke down the dairy enterprise, the dairy replacement enterprise, and then all the cropping enterprises. So there might have been a corn silage, a corn for grain, a soybean enterprise, new seeding enterprise, alfalfa enterprises. And ultimately, we came down to 3 that were utilized by all 3 of the operations. And that's really what we kind of wanted to key in on. Houston Engineering, as mentioned earlier, was also part of this project, as well as Grande Cheese. And we looked at the environmental impact and then the financial aspect of it. And that's where we brought in the financial data and utilized the FinBin database and the FinPack software to collect that data. So we keyed in on yield, direct cost of production, and gross return per acre those first 3 years of this project. Okay, so a few numbers, tried to sort it out so it wasn't as cluttered as Keith's page, but I did circle the ones I really want to focus on this morning here. So the project farms are the 4 farms that we worked with. The center column is the FinBin database, Minnesota and Wisconsin farms combined. So when you sort this database, you can pick out what criteria that you want to sort by. And then the far to the right column, as you're looking at it, is our Finbin, Wisconsin data. So in these first 3 years, we pulled in our numbers against the database and then pulled in an average for the 3 years. So we do have 2 more years of this project going on. So like Keith mentioned, we will have that 22 data that's coming in right now will be added to this database, and then we'll have our 23 data as well that we'll be able to analyze. A couple of numbers that I want to focus on, though, are our averages for direct cost of production. So we're looking at cost of production per, in this case, we're going to be per bushel here. Sorry, my label is off on that one, I guess. Corn grain, so direct cost of production per bushel. Our project farms came in at $3.89, and I'm going to compare mostly to our Wisconsin farms, since most of us in here are from Wisconsin. So $3.09. Well, doesn't look that profitable, does it? We're at about an 80-cent deficit compared to our average. However, you take a look at it, with the yields from our project farms, we're averaging about 15 bushels greater than our Wisconsin farms with an 80-cent investment. So if I go back one slide here, so I invested 80 more cents per bushel, but I'm seeing a greater return per acre. And if you want to look at bushels, I put it in there all 3 ways. So we have a 80-cent investment per bushel, 15 bushel per acre greater return, and then if you look at it in dollars and cents on gain per acre or gross return per acre, we're at about $108 per acre greater return on investment for that conservation practices. And I should say the conservation practices, it was a combination. Minimum of 5 different practices that our project farms implemented on their farms, whether it be a grass waterway, contour stripping, strip cropping, residue management, no-till management, so minimum till, all kinds of different conservation practices. And I'll touch on that at the end of how that is a little bit tricky when we start looking at data here. So that's our corn for grain analysis. Corn silage analysis, so mostly dairy producers, so we all had dairy corn silage for our dairy cattle. We start looking at our project farms versus our Finbin, Wisconsin farms again. We see a greater return per acre, but we also realize that we do have a greater cost of production. What would be some of those costs that could be associated with implementing conservation practices? This is where you guys engage. I'm a teacher, remember, I call on my students. What would be some of those costs that might be incurred of, let's say, somebody that utilizes cover crops? Don't be bashful.
More fertilizers?
Not usually, okay? A lot of times we do not allocate any of our fertilizer costs to the cover crop because we use that cover as a scavenger.
What about soil amendments?
Potentially, there might be some lime there. But if we have a cover, what do we got to do with it before we put a row crop in? We're gonna terminate it. We might have some fuel pass in there. We might have a greater seed expense because if we don't home grow that seed, we're gonna have to be purchasing some seed. So all those are contributing to that greater cost of production. But when we look at the return, so again, I broke it down same as I did for corn for grain, $8.64 per acre, or excuse me, per ton investment resulted in about 600 pounds to the acre greater yield, or $224.50 greater return per acre on our project farms versus our Wisconsin farms. So I don't know how you like to look at it. Do you like looking at production? Do you like looking at the dollar and cents behind it? But in this case, they're all favorable for us. Last analysis on the alfalfa side. So out of our 3 years of the project, you can see our project gross return per acre, project farms are going to be significantly higher. And this was the most substantial gain out of the 3 commodities that we analyzed. Direct cost of production per ton, again, we're a little bit higher there, about $16 per ton higher. But we look at a greater return of about 1,000 pounds to the acre, or a half a ton, and a $303.50 gain gross return per acre greater than our Wisconsin cohort. So we wanted to go a little bit deeper, and Keith showed us a nice slide of that soybean. If you remember his example earlier on, we wanted to go deeper. We wanted to go deeper into this data because we were collecting it. We were just looking at the gross return and our direct cost of production. Well, what about when you start incorporating all of our overhead costs, our machinery cost per acre, our interest rate if it's borrowed money, our land rent, what else? I gotta grab my card here quick. Crop insurance, repairs, custom hire, labor, interest, depreciation, and taxes. When we incorporate all of that data into the data set, we wanted to figure out what was happening. So the first 3 years of the project, we were able to benchmark our yields and our direct cost of production. We could make some pretty good analysis of it and realize that yes, we do have a higher direct cost of production, and a few of those contributions could be because of the custom hire and on manure specifically. And just let me tell you how we break down manure. So half of the custom hire manure goes to the livestock enterprise, and the cattle have to pay for it. Half of the custom hire manure goes to the crop enterprise, and we make the crops pay for it in the form of fertilizer. Okay, so that's just how we break that down. And then custom harvesting and land rent could contribute to those higher direct costs of production. However, the data does suggest that we do show that greater return per acre in all of our commodities. So the next year, 2021 data, this was what this is here. We'll add 22 data and 23 data to this as we move forward with this project. We started looking at some of those direct costs. What about our seed, our fertilizer, our chemical, the fuel, machinery cost per acre, cost of production with labor and management now. And I just pulled up corn silage. We have all the data for corn for grain, for alfalfa as well. I just pulled this one up because we only have 1 year of data tracked on this one. Again, once I feel a lot more comfortable showing numbers when we get 3 years of data, because then we can start seeing some trend lines. Seed, fertilizer, all of our direct inputs you can see are higher than our benchmark Finbin Wisconsin farms with cover crop. But again, when we implement some of those conservation practices, net return per acre, so now we're taking into account all of those expenses that I just listed off, labor, interest, depreciation, taxes, land rent, custom hire, repairs, fuel, oil, seed, fertilizer, chemical, insurance, pull into those. We can see that our project farms have a significant advantage over the other cohort with about a $350 net return per acre on corn silage, and a pretty significant yield advantage as well here, 22.5 versus 23.2 ton to the acre. However, we will realize that we do show a increased machinery cost per acre, and I would contribute that to the size of our project farms versus the size of the Finbin Wisconsin cohort. Most of the farms that we're working with, they have between 11 and 2,800 cows, and they're farming between 2,000 and 5,200 acres. So they're on the larger size compared to the Finbin Wisconsin data. So all this data collection, what can we pull from it? So we're continuing to refine how we collect that data, as Keith was mentioning earlier as well. We're trying to make sure that we're representing the environmental practices and the financial aspect behind them. We can conclude from the 3 years of data that we do have that we really, by implementing environmentally friendly practices, we are not sacrificing yield in this case, and we are showing a greater net return per acre. Utilizing the environmentally conscious practices is very challenging, as I mentioned earlier, because we have between 5 and 7 different practices being implemented. So we can't necessarily say, yep, I planted a cover crop, I'm going to be profitable. Okay? We can't necessarily say that because, as Tom mentioned, it's a management aspect. Okay? Those farmers are managing, they're working with what they're working with, and they're doing a nice job with it.